prosecution's last witness and most important expert.
The case that you're referring to was 10 years ago you testified in?
Yes, I've consulted about twice a year since then.
But the case was 10 years ago.
But the actual case in which I testified in court was 10 years ago.
And there was a doctor on the other side named Dr. Katz? Is that
Correct.
right? You didn't like him very much?
Correct.
And you agreed to testify for free in that case?
Correct.
Now, let's go over a little bit, if you'll just bear with me, about on your CV,
Sure.
which is so big it's hard to get through. Where's CV? There it is. Just a second, Judge. I'm trying to
Please.
find it. No, you think that's one thing I'd have. I'm sorry. Do you have an extra copy?
I can let you read it off my laptop if you want. Try again. I can email it to you.
You went to medical school in Stanford, is that right?
That's correct.
It's a very good institution, would you agree?
Yes, I would.
At the time you went, it was in 1978, is that correct?
Through 1983.
And you were you had mentioned that you were never a student of Dr. Paul White. Is that what you testified to?
He was a member of the faculty, and I was a student at Stanford, but that does not make me a student of Dr. White's.
I'm not arguing with you, I'm just asking, is that what you said?
Yes.
Nobody's arguing. There was
Yeah,
a question and then there was an answer.
Yeah. So you went to Stanford Medical School.
Correct.
Dr. Paul White was a professor there.
Incorrect. He was one of about 20 assistant professors in the Department of Anesthesia.
Okay, he was an assistant professor.
Correct.
And anesthesia was something that you became interested in during medical school.
That's correct.
Your testimony was that your first published paper where you were named in the published paper was in 1988, is that right?
I have to pull my own CV. Wait a moment here. I had papers before that, but they were published at meetings and things like this, and I eventually, because I didn't consider them peer-reviewed, took them off the list. So let me just pull my own CV if I may. Actually, it'd be easier to do it. Just a second here. Well, I believe my computer's deciding to spend time looking for the internet connection.
You want to show
in a moment. I believe my first paper is something called Testing Computer Controlled. Here it is, yes. There are several papers in 1988, including a paper of Dr. White's, and a paper with Dr. Jim Scott, and a paper with, two papers with Dr. Jim Scott. So there are three papers in 1988, one with Professor White and two with Professor Scott.
Well, the one in 1988 with Professor White, what was your involvement in that paper?
I did the computer programming and also the mathematics for the three-compartment model, which requires a rather more complex mathematics than for a two-compartment model. The actual modeling was done by my first wife, Dr Shafer.
Now we're gonna get back to that paper, but we're gonna get to that paper. I want to go back to 1978.
Sure.
After medical school, you went for residency. You went to a residency program
Correct.
at University of Pennsylvania.
That's correct.
And prior to going to that residency program, because of your interest in anesthesia, you and I'm going to call her Audrey because I don't know her last name. What's her last name?
Audrey Shafer.
Okay. Your first, what was it? Is that your
That's my first wife, Audrey
first one?
Shafer.
Audrey Shafer. You and Audrey both had conversations with Dr. White about your residency program.
I'm sure we did.
You had a relationship with Dr. White.
Yes.
And partly because of those conversations, and partly for other reasons, logistics. You went to another very good school, University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Is that right?
That's correct.
And there you studied anesthesia.
I was a medical intern and then an anesthesia resident.
Okay. After University of Pennsylvania, you went back to Stanford,
Correct.
and so did Audrey Shafer.
Correct.
And it was that about 1986?
That's correct.
Is that right?
1986.
All right. And it was during that time that Miss Audrey Shafer and you were involved in some of the research that was involved in the paper that eventually was published in 1988.
I believe it had started before that. Audrey, in her last, I took the remedial course through medical school and took 5 years. I worked with Don Stansky in my last year of medical school. That would be 1983. And Audrey worked with Dr. White during the same year in 1983. We continued that work by correspondence, both of us. Audrey was working with Dr. White and I was working with Dr. Stansky during internship and residency. And then when we returned in 1986, Audrey continued her work with Dr. White and I continued my work with Dr. Stansky.
And what was the name of the paper in 1988 that was published as a result of this work?
As the result of Audrey's work?
Well, in your work, I mean, let's be fair.
Audrey's paper was pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of propofol infusions during general anesthesia.
And you were involved in the computer dynamics, I guess the computer simulations and stuff?
Both the computer programming for that, making a program called Make Model work correctly, and I also, like I said, the mathematics for the 3-compartment model with variable rate infusions, which is what Dr. White had used, was not something that the computer program could handle, so I did the software for that.
All right, and that's in 1988?
Correct.
Which is early days of computing. Early days of computing?
That would be the
1988?
1950s.
All right, well, I mean, you actually had an old Osborne computer. Is that right?
I did have an old Osborne computer. Great machine.
Little bitty screen about this big.
Itty bitty screen.
And for record, I'm about 6 inches.
Is this really relevant to the discussion?
You did.
Go ahead, please.
It was very. Your work was very important because of the computer analysis. Would you agree?